If it's Friday, President Trump says he's now giving Elon Musk and his team at DOGE the authority to go into the Pentagon as the president plows ahead with sweeping cuts to federal agencies and Republicans try to keep up with his sweeping legislative agenda. Plus, the legal challenges facing the White House are piling up and threatening to stall some of the administration's top priorities as the government buyout program, the end of birthright citizenship, and Elon Musk's authority all face legal peril. And NBC News sits down with the president of Guatemala as Central American nations brace for the fallout of President Trump's immigration crackdowns and deportations. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where President Trump is forging ahead with sweeping changes to the federal government, and as his allies in Congress are struggling to keep up with his demands. This afternoon, the president answered questions from reporters after meeting with Japan's prime minister, acknowledging that he's allowing tech billionaire Elon Musk and his team at DOGE to look at nearly every federal agency and department, including, he now says, the Pentagon.
You directed Elon Musk to review Pentagon spending, given it's the biggest discretionary spending in the federal budget?
Yes, I have Pentagon, education, just about everything. We're going to go through everything. I've instructed him to go check out education, to check out the Pentagon, which is the military. And, sadly, you'll find some things that are pretty bad. But I don't think proportionally you're going to see anything like we just saw.
Now, my NBC News colleague Garrett Haake later pressed the president on Musk's unprecedented access inside the federal government.
Is there anything you've told Elon Musk he cannot touch?
Well, we haven't discussed that much. I'll tell him to go here, go there. He does it. He's got a very capable group of people. Very, very capable. They know what they're doing. But I will pick out a target, and I say go in. There could be areas that we won't, but I think everything's fertile. You know, we're a government. We have to be open. And as an open government, I don't know, I guess you could say maybe some high intelligence or something. And I'll do that myself if I have to.
It comes as President Trump and Mr. Musk are moving forward with drastic cuts to federal agencies, dismantling the U.S. Agency for International Development, which has seen its staff reduced from about 5,000 Foreign Service officers to less than 300 workers. Other agencies have been put on notice of potentially drastic cuts as well. President Trump's moves come as he seeks cooperation from congressional Republicans on his sweeping legislative agenda, which is running up against a deadline to fund the government and prevent a shutdown next month. After a marathon 5-hour meeting at the White House yesterday, it is clear that major divisions remain inside the House Republican Conference as President Trump pushes for trillions of dollars in tax cuts and hardline Republicans push for trillions of dollars in government spending cuts. House Speaker Mike Johnson provided this update to reporters earlier today.
If we put this on a short timetable and we move it as quickly and aggressively as we are planning to do, we can accomplish the entire agenda in one big, beautiful bill.
Do you expect to be working through the Super Bowl?
Yes, sadly. I'll be with the president in the suite, and this will be one of the big topics of discussion. So we need to keep the president and his team, fully apprised on the developments. We have been up to this point. There'll be a few more developments today, so I'll be addressing that with him and letting him know where we are.
Are you still committed to make this package deficit neutral?
That's our commitment. That's what we're trying to achieve, yes.
NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell joins me now. Also with me is NBC News chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles. Along with me, Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and an NBC News contributor. Kelly, let me start with you here at the desk. Let's talk broadly speaking about what we just heard at that press conference. President Trump saying that, yes, he is giving Elon Musk the green light to go into the Pentagon. What were your key takeaways from what you heard today?
Notably, the vice president is sitting in the front row, but there was all the talk about Elon Musk and what his portfolio is in this government, and it seems quite expansive. The president, at the same time, he said he didn't really talk about it with him that much, but seems to have given him wide berth to look at departments that, in fact, could present conflicts. At the Department of Defense, Elon Musk and his company have contracts with the Department of Defense. So could he possibly be accessing competitive information there? He's also given them the charge of looking at the Education Department. And the president repeatedly is talking in very accusatory terms about corruption in government. There is certainly a question about how you debate spending and whether spending might be bloated in places. Corruption is a much different thing. But he talks about that quite freely and wants to root it out, even though a lot of what we're talking about has been approved by Congress.
What is so notable is that he is doing all of this unilaterally without Congress, and that is the legal challenge that we are seeing to so many of these actions. So much of this government attempts to slash government spending is that, well, look, Congress approved this. Do you anticipate we're going to see this pace continue, this unilateral sledgehammer approach to slashing government spending?
It is his view of the presidency. Yeah. He seems to be disregarding Article 1 of the Constitution, which gives all that power to Congress. Right. And Democrats are talking about it, but Republicans are really not. And so the courts seem to be the only lever at this point to put speed bumps in front of the president on these matters to say, is it lawful? Does there need to be a pause? Have all the equities been considered? And when it comes to some of this, the president is saying they're identifying a lot, and he talked about transparency. Well, there's not much transparency with the DOGE effort. We don't know who the players are. We don't know what they're rooting out. We don't know what they're identifying. And so if the president is talking transparency, the American people typically like that, but we have not really seen it yet.
Yeah, we're going to talk to Ryan about this, but let me start with you, Kel, which is the president's legislative agenda, which is robust. Yes. He wants funding for his mass deportation plan. He wants massive tax cuts. He wants to extend the 2017 Trump-era tax cuts. Are you getting any clarity about what the path forward looks like there?
Well, certainly the president has indicated that he is willing to give a little room for the mechanics of Congress, recognizing that there are ways to package some of these programs that might be better in one or two bills and those kinds of things. And I think he is willing to cede a little ground when Thune and Speaker Johnson tell him about kind of the procedures. But in terms of what he wants, you're right. He wants all the money required for deportations. He wants those to go forward. And those tax cuts, which were a big part of his first term, he wants extended and expanded, including some of the things he campaigned on, like no tax on Social Security, no tax on tips, and so forth. All of that typically needs a way to pay for it.
Yeah, and it costs about $9 trillion. If you're talking about the entire tax package, Ryan Nobles, let me bring you into this. There was that 5-hour meeting at the White House on Thursday. Did anything come of it? I was told it was productive, but they still haven't presented a specific piece of legislation to start moving forward. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they made progress. I mean, everything they're talking about right now is behind closed doors, but the speaker indicated today that he felt confident that they would have some sort of a budget resolution as early as Monday, that it could include the debt ceiling, it could include a whole host of other things. But it's clear that the Senate is not as patient as the House would like them to be. You know, normally this process begins in the House and then the Senate takes whatever the House provides them and picks it apart. The Senate doesn't want to wait anymore, and we saw Lindsey Graham produce his own budget resolution today to begin that process on the Senate side. So there's going to be competing documents here that the two sides are going to have to work from. And, you know, it may be up to Donald Trump to pick which one he likes the most and how this process plays itself out. But they can't even really begin this conversation until they talk about exactly how much money they want to spend and how much money they want to cut. And that process doesn't begin until we see a document.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ryan. And as I was just discussing with Kelly, one of the big takeaways and headlines from the president's press conference today is that he's now directing Elon Musk to go into the Pentagon to find cuts there. What has the reaction on Capitol Hill been so far to that?
Well, every Republican that you ask about Elon Musk, they welcome it with open arms. They have no problem with it. They want him to look at every single aspect of government, and they are not at all concerned about the level of authority that Donald Trump is affording him at this point. Every single Democrat you talk to views it akin to the end of the democracy. They believe that it is borderline illegal. They believe that he has massive conflicts of interest. that specifically would be crystallized if he were to look into the Pentagon's budget because of the massive contracts that the company he owns hold, many of which are directly tied to the Department of Defense. There is not very much that Republicans and Democrats agree upon Capitol Hill, but there is probably no issue that they are more polarized on than the role that Elon Musk is playing in this early days of the Trump administration. Republicans are fully embracing it, and Democrats are fully rejecting it.
And Ryan, this all comes, of course, as a potential government shutdown is looming large. It's just over a month away. We saw back in December the government nearly shut down. How is that adding urgency to all of this? And frankly, how does this play into whatever timeline we might see in terms of the agenda on the Hill?
Well, Kristen, it probably doesn't shock you to find out, but one of the things that has always vexed me is, in the time that I've covered Congress is how little urgency there is when we approach a spending deadline. A month out, you would think that they have 4 years to solve this crisis. Nobody seems to be freaking out about the fact that we are closing in on a budget deadline and that we're closing in on one at such a precarious time where the parties are so far apart, and there would need to be bipartisan support to get something over the finish line. Chip Roy, who is, of course, the budget hawk from Texas, who feels emboldened by the election results and wants there to be real significant change, actually floated the idea of a continuing resolution today. He hates continuing resolutions, but he suggested to me that these continuing resolutions essentially adopt some of the budget cuts that Elon Musk is already attempting to employ. For instance, a continuing resolution that zeroes out the USAID budget. There's no universe in which you get a single Democratic vote for something like that, even if it means that the budget's going or that the government is going to shut down. So, at this point, I do not see how they get to an agreement by that deadline that is bipartisan enough, because it would still need 60 votes in the Senate. This would not be reconciliation to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government open. And Republicans are not just going to rubber stamp the budget as it currently exists, and Democrats are not going to go for a single budget cut, even if it's for a temporary period of time so that the appropriations process can play itself out. So I think this is a much bigger problem than everyone up here seems to think it is, at least at this point.
Well, you underscore just how complicated, how uphill the road may be to averting a government shutdown. Ryan, thanks for that. Kelly, let me go back to you.
My blood pressure's up after that. I don't know about yours, but that's a very daunting
it was going to be that hard.
Yes.
I know. Kelly, before I go to Peter Baker for the bigger picture look, there was also some news on the foreign policy front today. President Trump floating that he might meet with President Zelensky at the White House next week. That's significant. He has promised as a candidate he was going to end the war in Ukraine. What are you hearing about that? And he's got some other leader meetings next week, too.
And I've pressed him on conversations with Putin in the Oval Office as the pool reporter, and he has been very reluctant to give details, which for him is unusual. And so he's been saying there have been conversations ongoing. So I think what I glean from that is that he would like to get some resolution, and certainly it is harder than it looks. And he would like to see if one option is if you kind of constrain the U.S. Support for Ukraine, perhaps it hastens a result. He also again talked about Kim Jong-un in North Korea being a friend he wants to see again.
Fascinating. We'll have to see how that piece of his foreign policy plays out. Kelly O'Donnell, thank you so much. Great to see you here in person. Peter Baker, let me turn to you. Let's look at the big picture here. President Trump saying he's given Elon Musk and DOGE permission to look at the Pentagon. When Garrett pressed him, are there any limits? He didn't really suggest that there were any. What do you make of this relationship right now, Peter?
Well, it's an extraordinary one, and one that was captured on the cover of the latest issue of Time magazine, where you see an image of Elon Musk sitting behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. That's not an image that is designed to appeal to Donald Trump, who doesn't like it when other people steal his thunder, and they particularly doesn't like the idea that Elon Musk is portrayed as sort of the quasi-president or prime minister. Remember 8 years ago when Steve Bannon was put on the cover of Time magazine and basically portrayed as the power behind the throne. It definitely soured the relationship that he had with Trump. And by August of that year, he was out. So, there's been a lot of people watching to see whether that same dynamic might play out here. You've got two very big egos, two billionaires, two men with strong views about things. How long can that team work in an atmosphere where Trump doesn't always appreciate strong wills that don't subordinate themselves to him? So far, you saw Elon Musk just put on social media just today how amazing he thinks Donald Trump is. The reason, obviously, he would do something like that is to stroke the ego of the president so he wouldn't be upset about the Time magazine cover or wouldn't be upset about all the coverage about how Elon Musk is the one really running the government right now. But that's a very fraught and complicated dynamic here. And remember, they were not friends until just a few months ago, so there's not a long history here.
It's so fascinating to remember with you, Peter, that turning point of when Steve Bannon was on the cover of Time magazine. And of course, now Steve Bannon is an ally to President Trump. He's outside the White House. He's been very critical of Elon Musk. And I think he sort of represents the fact that there is this growing frustration inside some quarters of Trump's orbit where they do feel frustrated that Musk is starting to wear out his welcome. What do you make of that? Is anyone going to say that directly to President Trump?
That's a really good question. I don't know, but you're right. There are some people who think he's worn out his welcome. Remember, there are a lot of people who've been around Trump now for a number of years, some going back 8-10 years. And now suddenly Elon Musk has been, since July of last year, made himself out to be the number one surrogate. Not everybody likes that. I've heard senior Trump people say, I'm his best friend, actually, not Elon Musk. So, there's a jealousy factor there among other people in that orbit. But they all defer to Trump. Nobody's going to try to push Trump when Trump's not ready to be pushed. But when they sense that Trump is losing his own patience, you could bet there are at least some people around him who will be happy to stick the knife in.
Peter, let me ask you before I let you go about what Ryan and I were discussing, this uphill battle in Congress to try to get the president's agenda passed. Let's just take the funding for the president's mass deportation plan. The Republican Party can only afford to lose one vote right now in the House to act on any piece of Trump's agenda if they don't have Democrats' support. How do you see this playing out on the Hill?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. You're absolutely right. I cannot see for the life of me Democrats going along with any final budget spending plan that does anything near what Trump is talking about doing. It would be politically unthinkable for them to support tax cuts that would go primarily to the rich. If that's the way they see the final package going, it would be hard to imagine, as Ryan said, if for any of them supporting zeroing out the U.S. Agency for International Development, giving Trump or Elon Musk the power to do some of the things he's already doing in terms of paring down the federal workforce. All of this is anathema to Democrats. And I think they're perfectly happy to let the Republicans own it. They want to do it, fine, let them pass it. But you're right, the margins are so narrow, in fact, that Elise Stefanik, who has been tapped by President Trump to be his UN ambassador, can't be confirmed right now because they still need her votes in the House. They can't afford to lose that vote.
It's a great data point to keep in mind. Peter Baker, as always, thank you for your perspective. Really appreciate it. Great to see you on this Friday. Coming up, inside the mounting number of legal challenges that threaten to throw a wrench into the Trump administration's sweeping government overhaul. Plus, could DOGE's push to dramatically slash the size of the federal workforce impact the economy? We have the key takeaways from the first jobs report since Donald Trump took office. We'll delve into all of the numbers. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Stay with us. Welcome back. President Trump is starting to see some of his key priorities get tied up in the courts. So far, 2 federal judges have blocked his bid to end birthright citizenship. A judge in Massachusetts has pushed the deadline for federal government employees to accept a buyout offer. And right now, a judge in Washington, D.C. is hearing a case on whether the president has the authority to dismantle USAID. Joining me now is NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian and criminal defense attorney and an NBC News legal analyst, Danny Savalos. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. Ken, let me start with you. What is the very latest out of that hearing happening right now in D.C. challenging the president's dismantling of USAID?
Kristen, we're waiting to see whether this federal judge will grant the request by the unions representing Foreign Service officers and government employees to implement a temporary restraining order, essentially a pause on this plan to dramatically downsize USAID, which would go into effect midnight tonight if the judge does not act. So we're waiting to see whether that would happen. Obviously, the unions are arguing that this is illegal, that the Trump administration cannot do this. This agency was created by an act of Congress. And so, again, we'll just have to see what the judge does, Kristen.
Yeah, we'll have to see what the judge does and how quickly we might get a decision. Danny, how quickly do you think we could get a decision there?
Very difficult to say because, I mean, we're dealing with issues that courts have really never dealt with before. And that's such a common theme with all things Trump administration, whether it was 2017 or now. And I would say even more so in 2017, because that had a feel of people just hurrying out these executive orders and not thinking about them too much. And that appears to be the Trump approach. Why spend all the time on the front end vetting these executive orders legally when you can just throw them out in the ether and let a court prune them like a bonsai tree? And then whatever you're left with, great. And if it doesn't work, then back to the drawing board and try again. But I expect the courts will put a priority on this and get to them as soon as possible because we're dealing with stays, administrative stays, and other stays because people need to know what their rights are in the immediate future.
And Ken, the judge seems inclined to pause the USAID actions. What would that specifically look like?
Well, it would be a temporary restraining order while each side marshaled their arguments, and then they would have another hearing on the merits. But it would not start happening at midnight, so it would give people a temporary reprieve. And it's not just employees, Kristen. There are huge contractors who are owed millions of dollars by USAID, who have people all around the world implementing American foreign aid programs, and they are waiting to see what happens here as well.
Ken, let me ask you about a slightly different topic. In his press conference today, the president said he might fire some FBI agents who were involved in the January 6th investigations. We had seen reporting on this earlier in the week. What's the very latest here? What does he have the authority to actually do?
Yeah, so that was a big deal. He said that he believed that some of these agents were corrupt and that they would be fired quickly and surgically. So this is the culmination of a week of drama at the FBI. It started with the acting director last Friday, Brian Driscoll. Our reporting is that he staved off an effort to do a mass firing of some of these agents. And then he was demanded by the Justice Department to turn over a list of names of everybody that worked on January 6 cases. He resisted. He turned over only employee numbers. But then last night we saw a memo from him saying that he'd been ordered by the Justice Department to turn over the actual names. And of course, there's a court battle going on. The agents are suing the Justice Department. And today they got an agreement that the Justice Department would not release those names publicly. That was one of their big worries. But their bigger worry is that they will actually start firing some of these people without good cause. Because, look, there's no evidence that any of them committed misconduct or acted corruptly. Most of these cases resulted in convictions until Donald Trump pardoned everybody. So here is the president saying he will fire some of these agents, which, you know, sort of creates another wave of turmoil amid the FBI, because these are people who, many of whom were ordered to act in, to participate in these cases. They didn't do it voluntarily, and they felt like they acted lawfully and ethically. And now, Kristen, their jobs are at risk.
Yeah, Danny, let me go back to you, because I've been talking to Democrats throughout the course of the week, and they say their only real recourse to counter these actions, some of which they believe are not constitutional, is in the courts. But they also acknowledge the courts only move so quickly. So talk a little bit about the pace of what happens in court versus what we're actually seeing at the White House from President Trump and Elon Musk.
The courts are the proper way to challenge these actions. And I don't think there's too much to be concerned about in terms of speed. Consider, for example, the challenge to the federal buyout. The judge delayed that hearing and issued a kind of a stay, but I mean a stay for a matter of days, from Friday essentially to Monday. So you can see federal district courts can move with really impressive speed when they want to. And that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. You'll recall way back Bush v. Gore, they were able to resolve that in a matter of days, and a huge matter of constitutional import. So the short version is that when federal courts want to move quickly, they can. And these are incredibly important issues, which is why we're seeing all these stays. That's what the stay was designed to do. Yeah. Put a pause on everything and preserve the status quo until we can find out or get to the issue on the merits. But in the meantime, people don't lose rights they become accustomed to. Things like birthright citizenship or your federal employment, things that are definitely things you could say people are relying on. So the courts are going to move relatively quickly compared to other cases. Those will go on the back burner, the humdrum, everyday criminal appeals, things like that. This stuff will be handled immediately.
Danny, let me just ask you, because the Trump administration's been very clear, the president's been very clear, he's prepared to fight these battles all the way to the Supreme Court. Is it your expectation that most of these legal fights will, in fact, find their way to the Supreme Court?
They can. And the reason for that is we're talking about almost purely issues of constitutional or statutory interpretation. The facts are pretty much undisputed. So for that reason, it could advance to the court. These are issues, really, many of them of first impression. You don't even have a circuit split because this hasn't even come up before. So I expect these will get to the Supreme Court. They'll get to the Supreme Court relatively quickly. It's just a question of how far the Trump administration wants to push it. Because in the past, they backed off an executive order, redrafted it, gone back to the drawing board. But if they decide to fight all the way and everybody's interested in taking this all the way to the Supreme Court, then I think that's where these issues are going to end up, because they really represent, in many cases, constitutional issues, either of first impression or something that courts have really just never even addressed before or yet.
Well, there are questions about the constitutionality of Elon Musk's role. His title is special government employee. When it comes to his DOGE commission, he doesn't seem to have any authority in the Constitution. How does his position complicate any legal challenge? Is there a gray area there?
There is a gray area, and you can already see the different sides of the argument. The administration is going to argue that he's no more than just some outside advisor whispering in the ear of the administration. He has no official role. We don't have to listen to him. He's got no actual power because we're the decision makers, no matter who we're listening to, whether it's our constituency or a super rich guy who's not even from the country originally, but has lots of opinions on how to run it. So it really is, that is the way they're going to approach it. Of course, the argument, the other side of that is that, no, he is part of the government, whether it's unofficial or official.
All right. Danny and Ken, thank you both so much. Really appreciate your being here. Coming up next, NBC's exclusive interview with the president of Guatemala after his agreement with the Trump administration to accept migrants from other countries deported from the U.S. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. If it's the first Friday of the month, it's Jobs Day. This morning's report marking the first of the Trump administration and revealing a steady job market so far. The unemployment rate for January was just about on par with what economists expected, ticking down slightly to 4%. 143,000 jobs were added, which was slightly short of estimates, but still a decent gain. The report comes as uncertainty grows among a big chunk of the American workforce employers. Joining me now with insight into what these numbers mean is NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung. Brian, thanks so much for joining me on this Friday, Jobs Report Friday. So break down the jobs numbers for us. What do you think the key takeaways are for the economy?
Yeah, I like that. If it's the first Friday, it is Jobs Friday. And yes, we did get numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics showing us what the economy looks like in America as of January 2024. 2025, rather. I want to point out that this jobs report, the survey period was done the week before inauguration, so there's really no impact of the current administration from what we saw. But we did see the unemployment rate tick down to 4%. That is certainly good news when you consider that there was this concern that the unemployment rate had been kind of creeping up, although I want to point out 4% is still historically low, all things considered. But when we talk about the industry changes in terms of where the job gains were, take a look at healthcare, adding over 40,000 jobs in the month. Retail jobs, these are jobs at the mall, for example, adding over 30,000 jobs. And social assistance, interestingly, this implies nonprofits actually grew during the month of January, adding over 20,000 jobs in the month. But I want to point out leisure and hospitality, these are the bars and restaurants, which, by the way, drove a lot of the post-pandemic gains. That contracted by about 3,000. We'll have to watch that, as well as the black unemployment rate, which, by the way, did rise as well. So threads we'll have to watch as we go through 2025 as well, Kristen.
Yeah, for sure, Brian. And we know that we also got numbers for the revised numbers, I should say, for this report. Explain exactly what that means.
Yeah, this is a bit of nuance here, but every February, the Bureau of Labor Statistics goes back and takes a look at the different numbers. So again, what we're talking about here is, again, how many jobs were added per month in this country. Here are the monthly breakdowns. But again, these numbers were revised after that print today. I want to show you an overlay of what the original numbers look like. So when you take a look at, for example, January of 2024, the original number as reported was over 250,000. They revised it as part of the yearly process that they did today. It's now only just above 100,000 for the month of January. So you could see a lot of the months, the majority of them actually had downward revisions. And in total, it was almost 600,000 fewer jobs than were originally reported. But I want to point out this is standard. The average kind of change that we usually see is only about 0.1%. It was 0.4% in this case, Kristen.
Okay. So let me ask you about one other component that I know you've been watching closely, which is the administration's efforts to cut federal employees, this buyout program that we're seeing. What impact could that have on the economy? We know that about 60,000 people have taken the government up on that. That's actually short of what they were aiming for.
Yeah, and that's a thread we'll have to see in the next report because, again, this report doesn't give you that number because it was surveyed before the presidential reigns were passed over. But for right now, here's the status. 2.4 million federal employees, excluding the Postal Service. That's only 1.5% in terms of share of the overall workforce. But the Trump administration and Elon Musk want to see both of these numbers go down. But you mentioned, even if it is indeed the case that we had 60,000 buyouts, if that is reflected in the next report, 60,000 as a percentage of 2.4 million really isn't all that much. But could it affect the headline number in terms of monthly job gains? Certainly, that's going to be something we look for in the next report.
Well, I know you will watch all of it very closely. Brian Chung, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, as always. We want to turn now to immigration. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with leaders in Central America this week as the Trump administration continues its mass deportation efforts. Speaking at a news conference alongside Secretary Rubio in Guatemala City Wednesday, Guatemalan President Bernardo Arevalo announced that his country would accept more migrant flights, including ones carrying migrants from other countries. Our NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley sat down exclusively with the president to discuss the deal. Take a listen.
We came to very good agreements on the different issues. We agreed on the issue of migration, that we're going to be accepting a 40% increase in the number of flights of deportees.
Are there any parameters to how this would work?
The understanding is that we are not discussing about big numbers of people from other countries that are going to be coming here, because there are arrangements being made with other countries, with Mexico, with El Salvador, with Honduras, with Panama, and with Costa Rica.
And Julia Ainsley has more reporting on that interview.
That's right. I got to speak yesterday with Guatemalan President Arevalo, who said that after his meeting with Secretary of State Rubio, he left with the impression that the people that would be coming to Guatemala, those non-Guatemalan deportees from the United States, would be there temporarily on their way back to their home country. It's not clear, though, when that will start, how many people they'll take, or really how long they'll be staying in Guatemala, and whether or not Guatemala will have the help of the United States to try to support those people while they're in their country or help them get on to their home countries from there. I asked him about why he would agree to that. Here's what he said.
Why would you agree to take back migrants who aren't from Guatemala?
Because they are not staying in Guatemala. Because they are going, this is part of their repatriation to other countries.
And how will you be sure that they'll go to other countries? Will the U.S. help with that?
Yes, because we discussed that the United States is going to be helping us in this process.
And President Arevalo also said that Rubio promised some U.S. investment in infrastructure and promised to carve out and make sure that the U.S. would continue to provide for funding to combat drug trafficking in Guatemala and not cut that off in the slew of foreign aid cuts that the Trump administration has made. It is unclear, though, exactly when these will start. And we do know that there's a Guatemalan delegation coming to Washington soon to try to work all that out. But in the end, really, the reason the Trump administration asked for help from Guatemala is the same reason they asked for help from Guatemala in 2019 when they started sending Honduran nationals back to the country then. They're trying to find another place, another country that can quickly take in more deportees in a quick manner, especially when it comes to people from countries that are reluctant to take back their nationals, like China, which takes back very few of its nationals, like Venezuela, which Trump has said has just started to agree to accept back their nationals, but we haven't seen any flights there yet. So it could be that there are some people who get sent to Guatemala, a country they know nothing about, and it's unclear how they'll ever get back to their home countries. This is a space to watch because it's critical to Trump fulfilling that campaign promise of mass deportations, and it's also critical to having the cooperation from those partners in the region should migration surge again, or these people feel like they're getting the raw end of the deal.
Fantastic interview, and our thanks to Julia for that great reporting. Coming up after the break, more than 50 executive orders, tens of thousands of buyouts, and we're not even 20 days into President Trump's historic second term. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. For the fourth time, Democratic lawmakers tried and failed to gain access to a federal agency being targeted by Elon Musk. Today, lawmakers demanded entry to the Department of Education after the president signed an executive order abolishing the agency. But they were denied access to the building. This was the scene this morning. Take a look.
We're coming in. Who are you?
You're not coming in.
This is an outrage.
I'd like to speak with someone who works here.
So what are you going to do? You're going to beat us up if we go in?
I mean, you're going to,
we want you to move out of the way.
We're not steamrolling you.
Get out of the way.
This says all access evidence.
Stand aside, sir.
We're
This
members
says
of
all
Congress.
access evidence.
Please stand aside, sir.
I'm not standing aside.
Why not?
Because my role is to make sure that.
What authority do you have to block members of Congress from the oversight? We have oversight responsibilities. By what authority can you deny members of Congress their oversight role?
If you don't have a business reason to be here,
you do not have authority, sir.
Emotions running high throughout Washington and beyond. Joining me now is the panel, Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today, Joe Crowley, former Democratic congressman from New York, and Rob Bluey, president and executive editor at the Daily Signal. Thanks to all of you for being here. And as we start this conversation, Susan Page, we have some breaking news. A federal judge in Washington has just ruled to issue a temporary restraining order or a pause on the Trump administration's attempts to essentially gut USAID, for lack of a better word. What do you make of this moment that we are in, given all of the fast-moving changes, the pace with which President Trump and Elon Musk are trying to take a sledgehammer to federal spending?
Yeah, well, I think we're entering a new phase where the courts are really starting to weigh in. We've had almost 3 weeks, not quite 3 weeks, since President Trump's inauguration, where he has unleashed an incredible number of changes, of orders, of firings, all kinds of things. But now we see people pushing back through the court system, some injunctions, some efforts to pause some of the things he's done. That is, though, I think, a pretty slow process. We know the courts tend to be slow. They can sometimes slow things down but not stop them. And we continue to have this very compliant Congress. So the checks and balances system that the United States has counted on since its founding has not quite found its footing yet.
Certainly seems to be the frustration for many Democrats, the fact that the courts can only move so quickly. I am going to get to both of you, Congressman Crowley and Rob, in just a moment, but we do have Ken Delanian to break down what this essentially means, this pause, calling off the gutting of USAID. What exactly does it mean, Ken?
Well, federal judge Carl Nichols has agreed to the plaintiff's request to put in this temporary restraining order, this pause. He says, I will be entering tonight, sometime between now and midnight, a limited, very limited, he says, TRO that will be directed at the placement of the 2,200 or 2,700 employees on administrative leave, and then the accelerated removal of people from their countries. So he's putting on pause the plan to basically remove these people from the government payroll by midnight tonight. It's not clear from the information I have in front of me until when this pause will last, but it's designed to allow each side to more fully marshal their arguments and have a hearing on the evidence on the question of whether this move is legal. And then he'll actually have to rule on the merits, and then we'll go from there. I think one of the big questions here, and it's looming over all of these court fights, is will the Trump administration comply with these judicial rulings? Because they seem to be moving at a breakneck pace on all the personnel moves and the things that they're doing to disrupt the federal government. So we'll have to wait and see on that, Kristen.
Well, and you bring me to some extent to my next question. Before I ask it, just to update folks, Elon Musk has just tweeted out this building, the building of USAID, is now being occupied by CBP, Customs and Border Protection. Ken, to some extent, they've already gotten rid of thousands, tens of thousands of employees who work with USAID. So to some extent, has the damage already been done? Can it be reversed?
Well, enormous damage has been done. And this is about the facts on the ground, right? The Trump administration can establish facts on the ground almost before the courts can take into account the law. And so it's just like the previous discussion we were having about FBI agents being fired. Even if the firings are illegal, and even if eventually they win their jobs back with back pay, it's too late. They've already been escorted out of the building. Their badges have been taken away. Their security clearances have been revoked. They're not coming back to the FBI in most cases. And in this case, with USAID employees, you may have a similar situation. And the reputational damage that has been done to the United States, the national security damage, experts say, has already been enormous, even if everything is remedied and USAID is put back together in a week. This is going to take a long time to recover from, Kristen.
Ken, really great breakdown. Thank you for rushing to a camera for us. We really appreciate it. Congressman Crowley, let me go to you now. What do you make of these extraordinary developments that we are witnessing on a daily basis? President Trump, Elon Musk trying to dismantle these key agencies of the federal government in the name of savings, but getting blocked by the courts, it seems like, at every turn.
I don't think there's anything we can even compare this to in our history to make some sense of it. You know, my dad used to say it's easier to tear down a building than to build one. And I think that's what we're talking about here, the damage that's been done. But putting aside the damage that has been done internationally, just for a moment, the American lives that have been disrupted, that have been turned upside down, men and women who have dedicated their lives not to become rich and wealthy, but simply to do a good job, to promote America overseas. They have been told, basically by this administration, by this president, by DOGE, that their work was useless. Their work was meaningless. The work that their predecessors had done over decades and decades to build up the image of America overseas for democratization, that is always worthless. That's what they're saying. And that's what's so appalling, I think. These are like missionaries, these people. They are not making tons and tons of money. And they're not ripping anyone off. They're feeding the poor. They're feeding hungry, distended bellies in South America and in Asia and in Africa. That's what they're doing. And to be belittled by this administration is like nothing that's ever been happened before.
Rob, what's your take on this?
Yeah, let's take a step back, though, and not forget that USAID was engaged in some sorts of practices that some of those countries they were acting in did not exactly want them doing those types of things. So, yes, there are certain cases where they have been promoting freedom abroad. But if you go back and look at the law in 1961, the executive order that John F. Kennedy signed, I think we've come a far way today in terms of what USAID is doing. So there needs to be reforms, Congressman.
And you and I agree. I think that they were doing things that some of those countries didn't like promoting democracy. Well, they were doing that. The dictators don't like that.
An LGBTQ agenda and other things that...
Human rights agenda.
The other thing that I'd point out here is Ken use the word disruptor. That's what we're seeing here in Washington. I think the American people elected Donald Trump with the understanding that he was going to shake up the status quo, Kristen, and that's exactly what he's doing here.
Susan, what about that argument? He campaigned, Elon Musk stood next to him on the campaign trail. He said, we're going to slash government spending. And now they are doing it. Yes, they are doing it at a pace and with a breadth that I think has surprised even some of the president's closest allies. But what about the argument that he did say this is what he's going to do?
This is going to be the test because Americans were not happy with the direction of the country. They were ready for change, greater or lesser. That was the reason it's so hard to be the incumbent administration running for re-election. So they did vote for disruption. But did they vote for this much disruption? And did they vote for this kind of disruption? Because believe me, what happened at USAID is not going to be the end of this. Yeah. The president today at his news conference talked about the education board. He talked about changes at the Pentagon. Yeah. So this is, we are in uncharted waters here when we talk about the extent of change that we're going to see this year, this month, next week.
And can I just add one other point?
Please.
That is overseas. We have, our diplomats, we have our ambassadors, we have the CIA, we have other intelligence gatherers. Folks that worked at USAID, they were at the grassroots level. They were working with the people. They were hearing things that diplomats never hear. And we are less secure today as a country because of that. We're losing that, and that is not going to come back easily.
Rob, do you think the country is less secure? And if not, from a national security perspective, is there a risk of ceding ground to China, for example?
Well, I think the country's less secure because the Democrats held over Kash Patel's confirmation for a week. I mean, we need an FBI director who can basically be in a position and make sure that our law enforcement is aligned and keeping those threats at bay. But, you know, I think that we should give Secretary of State Rubio an opportunity to implement the reforms that he said he's going to do at USAID. And so at the end of the day,
they want to dismantle it. They want to destroy it.
We need to keep our eye on China. I agree with you on that point. They are a threat. And every single day that we're not focused on them, I think it's a day that we pose a risk to the United States.
Susan, we have less than a minute. The other big battle is going to play out on Capitol Hill with the Trump agenda. And boy, they had a 5-hour meeting at the White House yesterday. I was told it was productive, and yet there's still no clear path, it seems like, for how they're going to get his border plan passed and his tax plan passed.
That's right. They don't have a clear plan. They have divisions within themselves, and they should not expect help from Democrats. You know, even in the House, where they have a majority of one, they're going to need Democratic votes. Not clear to me that Democrats are going to be willing to provide them.
With all this going on, I don't see them playing ball with them at all.
All right. Guys, great conversation. Thank you so much for being here for the breaking news. Really appreciate it. Susan, Joe, and Rob. We will be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Over the next 2 years, a whopping 38 states will hold gubernatorial elections. That could bring big changes to which party controls the states, including presidential battleground states. Joining me on set is Jessica Taylor, Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report. Jessica, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's always great to have you here. Let's start off by talking about the gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and Virginia. These could be real bellwethers. Both governors currently term limited. What are you watching for?
Yeah, I mean, Republicans won this seat in 2021 when it was up last. It typically goes to the party that's out of power in the White House, so that certainly bodes well as a pickup for Democrats. We have that one rated toss-up. But New Jersey, Phil Murphy just narrowly won last time. And, you know, this is a state that only went for Harris by 6 points, much closer. So big primaries on both sides. We'll know more when we know who the nominees are.
Well, it's such a great point to remind folks of that surprise result out of New Jersey, that deep blue state where President Trump wound up doing much better than was anticipated. You're also tracking some potential pickups for Republicans. Where are you looking?
So the biggest ones in 2026, Kansas. This is a state that's vexed Republicans for 2 cycles in a row. Laura Kelly is term limited, so we have that one as their best pickup on the board for a lean Republican. From there, it's the open Michigan seat with Gretchen Whitmer term limited. Now, this could be a really interesting 3-way race. The Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan surprised a lot of people last year when he announced he's actually running as an independent. So does that could give Republicans a better shot at that? Congressman John James seriously looking at that race. Several Democrats in that race right now. Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State, but now with an open Michigan Senate seat, we're seeing people look at both races. Pete Buttigieg was looking at governor. Now he's looking more at Senate. Nevada is another place where Democrats are going to be targeting with Joe Lombardo there. That was the only state in 2022 that flipped from Democrat to Republican. But Katie Hobbs in Arizona only narrowly won in 2022. She's the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent. Democrats also looking at an open governor seat in Georgia with Brian Kemp term limited there that they're hoping to flip.
And I had an opportunity to interview Mike Duggan. He's adamant now is the time for a third-party candidate. We'll have to see how that'll be an interesting one to watch. What about Republicans? What are you watching for there?
So I think Republicans, we don't know yet if Tony Evers is going to run again in Wisconsin. They could have a prime pickup opportunity there if he retires. So Republicans also. But, you know, there's some seats that Republicans now have in some deep blue areas, even like, you know, Vermont. Phil Scott is fairly ensconced there. If he decides not to run again, that could be a key pickup opportunity. And then, you know, I'm watching places like New York with Kathy Hochul. She's so embattled, probably going to face a primary challenge. If she wins again, is she hobbled going into November if Mike Lawler, the moderate Republican congressman there, takes her on? So there's a lot of open seats we're also watching that could just stay in either party's hands, but there's just going to be a lot of new faces when it comes to governors.
You know what's so interesting? We spent the hour talking about the Trump agenda, how it's playing out, the fact that the battle right now is on Capitol Hill. A lot of discussion about should there be one bill, should there be 2 bills to act on his mass deportation plan, his tax plan. How much do you see what happens in the White House right now, how much the president is able to accomplish impacting some of these races?
Well, I think you have a lot of Democrats, particularly, that are sort of frustrated with Democrats in Washington, D.C. So you see J.B. Pritzker, he could run for a third term, possible 2028 candidate. Someone that's actually in a very good position, despite being in a perennial swing state, is Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. The best thing that might have happened to him was not being picked as VP. Republicans, again, they should be targeting this seat, but Shapiro is so popular, they don't have it at the top of their target list right now.
And you know, what's also interesting is that there's always this big question. Is President Trump going to endorse or is he not going to endorse? I mean, if you look at his polling right now, and I had a source say this to me last night, Elon Musk's polling is dropping. Let's put it that way. President Trump's polling right now,
he's at the highest he's ever been.
Right, exactly, and it's staying there.
You know, as you mentioned, we're not even 3 weeks into this administration. Yeah. We know what history tells us that this midterm should be for Democrats, and so that should bode well for Democrats across the country in the House and in governors, but we're not there yet. We cannot, you know, so these are our initial ratings as they come out. Follow us at the Cook Political Report for sort of the incremental changes.
And I don't want to get ahead of you, but what are you, in the next few weeks, you've got some more data coming out. What can we anticipate? We'll have you back to break it down.
Yeah, so our House ratings just came out this week from my colleagues Aaron Covey and Matthew Klein. The House is very much in play with such a slim margin. Senate coming out next week, though, it's a very difficult map for Democrats, even though they're defending fewer seats than Republicans. But to try to get the 4 seats that they need is just going to be a very tough task.
And just put this into historical context, if you could, for us, the fact that right now, Jessica, Republicans cannot afford to lose, can only afford to lose one vote if they want to get legislation passed without Democrat support. We talk about this being an historically narrow margin. I was on Capitol Hill. You could feel it. Yeah. They were like, this is incredibly challenging. Talk about how rare it is to have a margin that's that slim.
I mean, we haven't seen it in decades, really, that you typically do see one party have more of a cushion. So it's just, it's certainly, yeah.
Yeah. So and to follow through with that, one person said to me, there's no room for error. No. I mean, it's usually you see a party have a couple of different.
I mean, someone being out sick can sink it. Right. Can completely sink, yes.
Can completely sink it. Yeah. Okay. So when you talk about these gubernatorial races, Jessica, what do you think are going to be some of the most hard-fought gubernatorial races?
I think Michigan, Wisconsin is the swing states that we've seen. Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia.
Okay, Jessica Taylor, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Great to see you here. And before we go, I want to send a big congratulations to my friend, colleague, and mentor, Andrea Mitchell. After 17 incredible years of host of MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports, Andrea signed off for the final time today. From the beaches of Alaska to the Munich Security Conference, Andrea has brought her viewers countless scoops and news-making interviews. We are just so lucky that even as she steps away from the anchor chair, Andrea will continue to bring us her unparalleled reporting here at NBC News. And this Sunday, you can catch her on with me on Meet the Press, so be sure to tune in. I'll also have exclusive interviews with Senator Andy Kim, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and American poet Amanda Gorman. The news continues with Tom Costello in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.